Whiskey, wet wool, and cheap tobacco choked the trading post air. Auctioning off a widow and her 7 orphans like sway-backed mules wasn't right, but Oakhaven was freezing and dead broke. Clarissa stood on a salt crate, jaw locked tight, waiting for the town to tear her family apart. Nobody wanted 8 starving mouths, nobody except Boone, a massive, scarred hermit who thoroughly hated people. "I'll take her," he grunted from the shadows. "And the kids." Everyone thought he was crazy. The trading post smelled of wet sheep's wool, stale beer, and the metallic tang of mud. It was November in Oakhaven, a miserable stretch of timber and dirt that barely qualified as a town. Rain lashed against the warped glass windows, blurring the yellow light of the oil lamps into smeared streaks. Boone stood in the back corner, his shoulder pressed against the rough-hewn pine logs of the wall. He was only there for coffee beans, salt, and black powder. He hadn't planned on a spectacle. He hated spectacles. In the center of the room, standing on a wooden crate that usually held salted cod, was a woman. Her name was Clarissa. Boone only knew this because Mayor Higgins kept barking it out between wet, hacking coughs. Clarissa's calico dress was stiff with dried mud at the hem, the fabric thinning at the elbows. Her jaw was locked tight. She wasn't crying, though her eyes had that flat, glassy look of an animal that had run until its lungs bled, and finally realized the hounds were in front of it too. Clustered around her skirts, gripping the fabric until their knuckles turned white, were 7 children. The oldest, a boy who looked about 14, stood in front of his mother with his chin jutted out, though his knees trembled. The youngest was a lump wrapped in a grey wool blanket, pressed against Clarissa's collarbone. "I ain't saying it's Christian," Higgins muttered, wiping sweat from his red forehead with a dirty handkerchief. "But winter's coming. The town fund is dry. We can't feed 'em. The bank took the farm when Miller died. So we're doing this practical." The men in the room shifted. Boots scraped against the floorboards. Someone coughed. "I can use the older boy?" A man named Miller spat onto the floorboards. "Put him in the livery. He can muck stalls. The mother can do laundry for the saloon." "What about the little ones?" Higgins asked. "Send 'em east on the next rail car. Orphanage in St. Louis will take 'em, or Denver." Clarissa flinched. It was a tiny movement, just a sudden tightening of her shoulders, but Boone saw it. She pulled the boy closer. "You aren't splitting my family," she said. Her voice was raspy, scraped raw by cold and exhaustion. It wasn't a plea. It was a statement of fact that carried absolutely no weight in a room full of men with ledgers. "Mom, you don't have a say." Higgins sighed, genuine fatigue in his voice. "You've got no money, no kin. In a week, you'll be freezing in a tent by the creek, and we'll be digging 8 small graves in frozen dirt. Now, who'll take the older girl? She looks strong enough to scrub floors." Boone shifted his weight. The coarse burlap of the flour sack under his arm scratched against his leather coat. His chest felt tight. He tasted old coffee and raw tobacco in the back of his throat. He didn't want this. He lived 6,000 feet up the mountain for a reason. People meant noise. People meant disease, complications, and eventually graves. He had spent 5 years perfecting the silence of his cabin, learning to listen to the wind whistling through the pines instead of the ghosts in his own head. But looking at the oldest boy, the way he was trying to shield his little sister from the stares of the town, a sharp, uncomfortable pressure bloomed behind Boone's ribs. It felt like swallowing a burr. He remembered a different dirt floor, a different group of men in suits tearing a family apart. "Damn it," Boone thought. He ground his teeth together, the muscle jumping in his jaw. "I'll take the lot of 'em," a voice said. It took Boone a second to realize the voice was his own. The silence that followed wasn't just quiet. It was a physical weight. Every head in the trading post turned towards the dark corner. Boone stepped into the lamplight. He was a massive man. built thick and wide, wearing a coat of tanned elk hide that smelled of wood smoke and pine pitch. His beard was unkempt, his eyes shadowed beneath the brim of a battered Stetson. Higgins blinked, his mouth dropping open. "Boone, you? You heard me." Boone walked forward. His boots thumped heavily against the floor. He didn't look at the men. He looked straight at Clarissa. Up close, he could see the faint network of purple veins under the pale skin of her temples. She smelled like cheap lye soap and fear. "You can't take 8 people up to that ridge." Higgins stammered. "You ain't got the provisions. You're a hermit." "I got elk meat hanging in the shed. I got flour. I got wood." Boone stopped in front of the crate. He looked up at Clarissa. Her chest was rising and falling rapidly. "Get off the box." Clarissa stared down at him. She didn't move. "I don't know you." "I'm Boone." "Why are you doing this?" Her voice was a low whisper, meant only for him. Boone looked at the 14-year-old boy. The kid was glaring at him, terrified but trying to look dangerous. Boone looked back at Clarissa. "Because the floorboards in here are rotting, and I'm tired of listening to these men breathe. Are you coming or not?" It was a terrible proposal. It wasn't heroic. It was blunt and awkward. But Clarissa looked at the livery owner who wanted to enslave her son, and then she looked at the mountain man. She stepped down from the crate. "Gather your coats," she told her children. The rain turned to sleet 2 miles out of town. It hit their faces like tiny shards of glass. Boone drove the wagon, a sturdy flat-bedded thing pulled by 2 stubborn mules named Cast Iron and Rust. He had wrapped the younger children in the heavy, grease-stained buffalo robes he kept in the back, burying them deep among the sacks of flour and kegs of nails. Clarissa sat beside him on the buckboard. She had refused to ride in the back under the pelts. She sat ramrod straight, her thin woolen shawl offering absolutely no protection against the biting wind. Boone glanced at her out of the corner of his eye. Her lips had a bluish tint. Her hands were tucked tightly between her knees to keep from shaking. "You're freezing," he said. His voice sounded loud over the steady squelch, pop of the mule hooves in the deep mud. "I'm fine," Clarissa lied. Her teeth clicked together as she spoke. Boone swore under his breath. He reached behind his seat, pulling his thick, wool-lined duster free from a pile of rope. He tossed it onto her lap. It smelled strongly of horse sweat, old leather, and pipe tobacco. Clarissa looked at it, then at him. "I said I'm fine." "Pride doesn't keep your blood warm, Mom. Put the coat on before I have to stop the wagon and listen to you freeze to death." She bristled, her eyes flashing with a sudden angry heat. Good. Anger kept the blood pumping. She pulled the massive duster around her shoulders. It swallowed her whole, the sleeves hanging past her hands. Behind them, the kids were eerily quiet. Boone strained his ears, listening for a cough or a cry, but there was nothing except the rattle of the wagon and the whistling wind. That bothered him more than crying would have. Kids that quiet were kids who had learned that crying didn't bring help. It only brought trouble. "The oldest boy," Boone said, breaking the silence. "What's his name?" "Tom," Clarissa said. The coat was warming her up. Her voice was less brittle. "Mary is 12. Seth is 10. Caleb is 8. Annie is 6. Jacob is 4. And the baby?" "Nellie, 6 months." Clarissa turned her head, looking at his rough profile. "What are your rules?" Boone pulled back gently on the reins as the wagon hit a deep rut. "Rules? I'm not a fool, Mr. Boone. A man doesn't take on another man's widow and 7 orphans out of charity. Not out here. You expect something. You want me to cook, clean, mend. You want the boys to work the timber." She took a shallow breath. "You want me in your bed. I need to know the terms." Boone's hands tightened on the leather reins. The leather groaned. A hot spike of irritation drove into the back of his neck. He stopped the wagon entirely. The mules snorted, their breath pluming white in the freezing air. He turned to fully face her. Clarissa shrank back a fraction of an inch, but she held his gaze. "Let's get something straight," Boone said, his voice dropping to a gravelly low pitch. "I live alone because I like it. I didn't buy you. I ain't looking for a maid, and I damn sure ain't looking for a wife. I pulled you off that block because Higgins is a snake, and splitting up a litter of kids is a rotten thing to do." He pointed a thick, calloused finger at her. "You keep the kids out of the woods where the bears are. You don't touch my rifles. You help with the chores because everybody works to eat. When the spring thaw comes, if you want to leave, I'll take you to the rail depot in Cheyenne myself. Until then, you're just trying to survive winter in my house. Are we clear?" Clarissa stared at him. The sheer hostility in his voice wasn't aimed at her, she realized. It was aimed at the situation. He was just as trapped as she was, and he was terrified of it. "Clear," she said quietly. Boone grunted, snapped the reins, and the mules lunged forward again. The trail steepened. The mud began to freeze into hard, jagged ruts as they climbed higher into the tree line. The air grew thinner, sharper, carrying the distinct metallic scent of a heavy snowfall. They rode the rest of the way in silence, the weight of the 8 strangers pressing down on Boone's chest with every mile. Boone's cabin sat tucked against the sheer granite face of a mountain ridge, shielded from the worst of the northern winds by a dense stand of ancient blue spruce. It was built of thick, unpeeled logs. There was a shed to the right, and a small corral. It was built for one man, maybe a man and a dog. When Boone pushed the heavy oak door open, the stale air rushed out. It smelled of cold ash, dried herbs, and the distinct musky scent of a tanned bear hide that hung on the far wall. "Everybody inside," Boone ordered, carrying a sack of flour on one shoulder and a crate of supplies in the other arm. Clarissa stepped in first. She stopped dead in the doorway, causing the children behind her to bump into her skirts. The single room was dominated by a massive stone hearth. There was one bed in the corner, a crude wooden frame strung with rope and piled with furs. A rough-hewn table sat in the center with a single chair. Cast iron skillets hung from nails driven into the logs. There were guns, 3 rifles and a shotgun racked above the door. The floor was packed dirt. It wasn't a home. It was a shelter. Clarissa looked at the single bed, then at her 7 children. "I know," Boone said, dropping the supplies with a heavy thud onto the table. "It ain't the Ritz." He didn't wait for her to complain. He walked to the hearth, grabbed a handful of dried pine needles and kindling from a tin bucket, and struck a match. The sulphur hissed. Within seconds, a small fire licked at the dry wood. He piled on split birch. The smoke drafted up the stone chimney, and the smell of burning wood finally masked the stale air. "Kids, get out of the wet coats!" Clarissa commanded, shaking off her initial shock. The survival instinct kicked in. She unbundled Nellie, laying the sleeping infant carefully in the center of Boone's bed. Boone watched them awkwardly. Suddenly, his sanctuary felt violently loud. The floorboards creaked under multiple feet. The 4-year-old Jacob began to cry, a high, reedy sound that pierced Boone's eardrums. The older boys were looking around, their eyes darting to the rifles and the hunting knives on the shelf. "Don't touch the blades," Boone said sharply to Tom, who had drifted too close to a skinning knife. Tom snatched his hand back, his face flushing red. "I wasn't going to steal it." "Didn't say you were. Said don't touch it, it's sharp." Boone dragged a hand down his face, feeling the grit and sweat in his beard. He needed space. He needed to hit something. "I'm going to chop more wood. Dinner's in the root cellar. Trapdoor under the rug. Grab the salted pork and some potatoes. He grabbed his axe and walked out into the freezing night, pulling the door shut behind him. The cold hit him like a physical blow. The snow was starting to fall now, thick, heavy flakes that stuck to the pines. Boone walked over to the chopping block. He grabbed a massive round of oak, set it on the block, and swung the heavy axe. Crack! The wood split perfectly in two. He set up another. Crack! What had he done? He struck the wood harder, feeling the vibration shoot up his forearms. He had barely enough meat to get himself through a bad winter, let alone 8 people. He didn't know how to talk to kids. He didn't know how to be around a woman. He liked silence. He liked reading by the fire without anyone asking him questions. He swung the axe again, burying it deep into a knotty piece of pine. It stuck. He cursed, wrenching the handle back and forth. "You're angry." Boone froze. He looked over his shoulder. Clarissa was standing on the porch. She had taken off his duster, and she was hugging her arms against the cold. The firelight from the open doorway threw long shadows across the snow. "I ain't angry." Boone grunted, yanking the axe free. "You chop wood like a man who wants to hit something else," she said. She stepped off the porch. Her thin boots crunched in the fresh snow. "I put the pork on to boil. I found your oats. I'm making porridge for the little ones." "Good." Clarissa stood a few feet away from him. In the pale moonlight, the hollows of her cheeks looked deeper. "You regret it already." Boone leaned the axe against the block. He wiped the snow off his forehead with the back of his leather glove. "Mum, I don't know you. You don't know me. Regret implies I had a plan in the first place." "You saved us," she said, her voice wavering just a fraction. It was the first crack in her armor he had seen all day. "I won't pretend I understand you, but my children were going to be scattered to the wind, or starved. You took us in." Boone looked at her, really looked at her. He saw the sheer exhaustion in the droop of her shoulders, the terrified mother hiding behind a wall of defiance. "Winter up here is brutal, Clarissa," Boone said, his voice softer than it had been all day. It was the first time he used her name. "The snow will get 10 feet high. The wolves will come down the ridge looking for easy meat. We are going to be trapped in that room for 4 months. "I've survived worse," Clarissa said, staring him dead in the eye. Boone nodded slowly. "We'll see." He picked up an armful of split wood. "Go inside before you catch your death. The baby's crying." Clarissa listened. The muffled sound of Nellie wailing drifted through the heavy logs. She turned and went back inside. Boone stood in the snow for a long moment, letting the freezing air numb the headache building behind his eyes. He looked out at the dark tree line. The town thought she was the burden. But as Boone walked back toward the cabin, he knew the real danger wasn't the starvation, or the cold, or the 7 kids. The real danger was that for the first time in 5 years, Boone actually had something to lose. The storm hit on the second night. It didn't announce itself with a dramatic clap of thunder. It simply swallowed the mountain in a suffocating, blinding wall of white. The wind shrieked through the spruce branches, hitting the cabin with enough force to make the heavy timber groan. Inside, the air was thick. The cabin had been built to hold the scent of one man, old leather and pipe smoke. Now it smelled of sour milk, wet wool, unwashed hair, and the sharp, metallic tang of anxiety. 8 people breathing the same stagnant air turned the single room into a pressure cooker. Boone slept on the floor near the door, a heavy buffalo hide pulled over his head to block out the noise. It didn't work. He could hear every rustle of the straw mattress where Clarissa and the youngest 3 were piled. He could hear the shallow, rattling breaths of Tom and Seth, who slept on a pallet of pine boughs near the hearth. He could hear the wind searching for cracks in the mud chinking. He hadn't slept a full hour in 3 days. "Tom, add another log. It's freezing." Clarissa's voice was a harsh whisper, cutting through the dark. Boone opened one eye beneath his hide. The fire had died down to glowing orange embers, casting long, shivering shadows across the dirt floor. The temperature in the room had plummeted. Boone could see his own breath pluming in the dark. He heard Tom scramble up from the pallet. The boy was shivering violently, his teeth clicking together. Tom grabbed a chunk of wood from the indoor pile and threw it onto the embers. Then, wanting to impress his mother, or maybe just desperate for heat, he reached into a small canvas sack sitting on the mantel. Boone threw the buffalo hide off. "Don't touch that." His voice was a gravelly bark that made Tom jump, dropping the sack. A pile of splintered, resin-heavy wood spilled onto the hearth. "I was just trying to get the fire up," Tom said, his voice cracking defensively. He puffed his chest out in his long johns, trying to look imposing despite the goosebumps covering his thin arms. Boone pushed himself off the floor. His back ached from the hard dirt, and a dull throb pounded behind his temples. He stalked over to the hearth, towering over the boy. He knelt, picking up the scattered splinters with thick, calloused fingers. "This is fatwood," Boone said, his voice dangerously low. "Pitchpine. I spent 3 weeks in September climbing dead trees to harvest this. It catches a spark when regular wood is too wet to burn. It's for emergencies. You don't waste it because you're a little chilly." "We're freezing." Tom shot back, his fists clenching. "And you were asleep. You expect me to just let my sisters freeze?" "I expect you to use your head." Boone snapped, the sudden volume making Mary flinch on the bed. "You put on another layer. You huddle closer. You don't burn the survival gear." "Stop it." Clarissa was off the bed in a second, pulling a thin blanket around her shoulders. She stepped between Boone and her son, her bare feet planted firmly on the freezing dirt. She smelled like old sweat and fear, but she didn't back down. "He made a mistake. He's 14. Out here, 14 is a man." Boone sneered, pointing a finger at the spilled wood. "And out here, mistakes mean you freeze to death in February because you burned your last dry tinder in November." Clarissa stared up at him. Her face was pale, the dark circles under her eyes bruised and heavy. "We don't know your rules, Boone. We don't know this mountain. You can't expect him to be a frontiersman in 3 days. If you're going to yell at someone, yell at me." Boone glared down at her. Her jaw was tight, trembling slightly. The vein in her neck pulsed. She was terrified of him, but she was standing her ground anyway. A heavy, suffocating wave of claustrophobia hit Boone directly in the chest. He looked at Clarissa, at Tom's defiant but frightened face, at the wide, terrified eyes of the younger children peeking out from the furs on the bed. He was drowning in them. Boone turned away, letting out a sharp, angry exhale through his nose. He grabbed his heavy elk-hide coat from a peg by the door, shoved his arms into the sleeves, and grabbed his rifle. "Where are you going?" Clarissa asked, her voice faltering. "It's a blizzard." "To get some peace." Boone grunted. He yanked the heavy oak door open. The wind howled, instantly blasting a layer of powdery snow onto the floorboards. The sheer violence of the cold felt like a slap to the face. Boone stepped out into the howling white void and pulled the door shut behind him, leaving them in the dim, quiet cabin. He waded through waist-deep drifts to the woodshed, his boots crunching loudly in the dark. He sat on the chopping block in the pitch black, the wind tearing at his coat. He preferred the lethal, biting cold to the crowded warmth of the cabin. The cold was simple. It just wanted to kill you. It didn't ask questions, it didn't cry, and it didn't look at you with desperate, starving eyes. He sat there until his fingers went numb and his beard froze solid with his own breath. Only then, when the shivering became uncontrollable, did he force himself to go back inside. The storm raged for 5 days. When the wind finally broke, it left behind a profound, ringing silence. The snow was piled halfway up the cabin windows, turning the light inside a milky, submerged blue. Boone stood by the small window, scraping away a layer of frost from the glass with his thumbnail. He watched a massive pine branch snap under the weight of the snow and crash silently into the deep drifts below. They were trapped. He turned around. The cabin was a picture of cramped misery. Clarissa was standing by the hearth, stirring a pot of watery oat mush. Her knuckles were split and bleeding from scrubbing the children's dirty clothes in a bucket of melted snow. The younger boys, Seth and Caleb, were wrestling on the floor, kicking up dust that caught in the shafts of pale light. The baby, Nellie, was fussy, her cries a constant grating static in the background of Boone's mind. Boone walked over to the corner, pulling a heavy canvas tarp off a stack of supplies. He dragged a large, iron-bound cedar chest into the center of the room. The wood scraped loudly against the dirt floor, silencing the boys. "Tom," Boone said, not looking up as he unclasped the heavy iron lock. "Grab the axe. We need to clear a path to the creek and break the ice. We need fresh water." Tom puffed up instantly, eager to prove himself after the Fatwood incident. He grabbed his thin wool coat and shoved his feet into his boots. "I'm ready." Boone looked at the boy's feet. The boots were town leather, worn smooth on the soles, the stitching pulling apart at the toes. "You step out in those. Your toes will blacken and fall off by Tuesday." Boone opened the chest. The smell of mothballs, dried lavender, and old blood drifted into the room. He reached inside and began pulling things out, tossing them onto the floor with heavy thuds. A massive, untanned deer hide, the pelt of a timber wolf, strips of dried sinew, a rusty awl, a curved bone needle. Clarissa stopped stirring the oats. She wiped her hands on her apron and walked over, staring down at the pile of dead animals. "What is this?" "Survival," Boone said flatly. He picked up the bone needle and held it out to her. "You know how to sew?" "I can mend a hem," Clarissa said defensively. "Hemming cotton won't keep the snow out. You need to line their boots with the deer hide, hair on the inside, double layer the soles." Boone kicked the wolf pelt toward her. "Cut this down. Make mittens for the little ones. If their hands get wet and freeze, they're useless." Clarissa knelt by the pile. She reached out, touching the thick, coarse fur of the wolf pelt. It was beautiful, but it smelled wild and raw. She looked at Boone's massive, calloused hands, then down at her own. Her skin was chapped red, the cracks on her knuckles oozing tiny drops of blood. Boone noticed. He didn't say anything, but he turned and walked to the small shelf above the wash basin. He grabbed a small tin and tossed it underhand. Clarissa caught it against her chest. "Bear grease," Boone said, turning his back to grab his rifle from the rack. "Rub it into your hands before you sew the leather. It softens the hide and it'll stop your skin from splitting." Clarissa opened the tin. It smelled rancid and thick, like old meat and dirt. Her stomach rolled, but the pain in her hands was a constant burning throb. She scooped out a fingerful of the greasy paste and began working it into her knuckles. It stung at first, a sharp, biting pain, but then a deep, soothing warmth followed. "Thank you," she murmured, barely loud enough to be heard over the crackling fire. Boone grunted. "Don't thank me. Bleeding on the leather makes it stiff." He shoved the door open, using his shoulder to push back the 3-foot snowdrift, blocking the frame. "Tom, you step exactly where I step. You don't wander. The snow is hiding the deadfalls." The door shut behind them, plunging the cabin back into quiet warmth. Clarissa sat on the floor for a long time, staring at the tin of bear grease. He was a brutally hard man. He spoke to them like they were stray dogs he was forced to feed. But as she rubbed the foul-smelling grease into her bleeding hands, she realized something. The town had offered her pity, and it would have killed them. Boone offered no pity at all, only the harsh, ugly tools to stay alive. That night, after the children were asleep, the cabin was eerily peaceful. The fire popped, sending sparks up the stone chimney. Boone sat at the small table, working a rag soaked in gun oil over the barrel of his Winchester. Clarissa sat cross-legged on the floor near the hearth, fighting the thick deer hide. It was exhausting work. Pushing the heavy bone needle through the tough leather required her to wrap her hand in a rag and shove with all her weight. She grunted in frustration as the needle got stuck halfway through a seam. Boone paused his oiling. He watched her struggle for a moment. He enjoyed the silence, but the sound of her frustrated breathing was grating on his nerves. He set the rifle down, walked over, and crouched beside her. "You're fighting it." Clarissa looked up, wiping a strand of damp hair from her forehead. "It's like trying to sew a plank of wood. You're trying to push it straight through." Boone reached out. His massive hand completely engulfed hers as he adjusted her grip on the awl. His skin was rough as sandpaper, radiating an intense heat. Clarissa froze, her breath catching slightly at the sudden, unexpected contact. "Punch the hole first," Boone instructed, his voice lower, lacking its usual bark. He guided her hand, pressing the awl into the leather with a twisting motion. Pop! It broke through. Then the needle follows. "Don't force the bone. It'll snap, and I don't have another one." He let go of her hand and stood up, moving back to his rifle as if the interaction hadn't happened. Clarissa looked at the hole in the leather. She threaded the sinew through easily. She kept working. The rhythmic punch, pull, tighten becoming a mindless meditation. "Did you make your own coat?" she asked softly, an hour later. Boone didn't look up from his rifle. The silence stretched so long Clarissa thought he was going to ignore her. "My wife made it," Boone finally said. His voice was completely flat, devoid of any emotion. It wasn't a fond memory. It sounded like a heavy stone dropping into a deep well. Clarissa's hand stilled on the leather. "Wife." The word hung in the smoky air. She looked around the cabin. There were no feminine touches, no faded ribbons, no carved combs, no extra clothes. Just the overwhelming presence of a solitary man. She didn't ask what happened. Out here, asking how someone died was like asking what color the sky was. The answer was usually violent, sudden, and deeply unfair. "It's a good coat," Clarissa said quietly. Boone slid the bolt of the rifle back with a sharp, metallic clack. "It keeps the cold out," he said, and he didn't say another word for the rest of the night. By the second week of January, the root cellar was a graveyard of empty burlap sacks and rotten potato skins. The cold had finally won the war of attrition against the cabin's insulation, seeping through the mud, chinking and settling permanently into the floorboards. The air inside smelled constantly of wet wood ash and boiling bones. Clarissa had been boiling the same elk femurs for 6 days. The broth in the cast-iron pot no longer had any fat floating on the surface. It was just hot, cloudy water tasting faintly of marrow and desperation. Hunger didn't announce itself with dramatic fainting spells. It was a slow, heavy lethargy that turned the children into ghosts. Seth and Caleb stopped wrestling. They spent the days huddled under the wolf pelt blankets, staring at the ceiling with dull, sunken eyes. Annie sucked on the corner of her blanket until the wool frayed. But it was Nellie's silence that terrified Boone the most. The baby had stopped crying. She didn't have the energy. She lay against Clarissa's chest, making weak, clicking sounds with her tongue. Clarissa was drinking boiling water steeped with pine needles. desperately trying to force her body to produce milk. It wasn't working. Her cheekbones looked like they were going to slice through her pale skin. Boone sat at the table, sharpening his skinning knife on a whetstone. Shh! Shh! The rhythmic scrape of steel on stone was the only sound in the room. He hadn't eaten solid food in 4 days. He had given his last ration of dried venison jerky to Tom, who needed the protein to keep swinging the axe for firewood. Boone's stomach had stopped rumbling days ago. Now it just felt like a cold iron knot sitting behind his ribs. He stood up, the wooden chair legs screeching against the packed dirt. The sudden movement made his vision swim. Dark spots danced in his periphery. He grabbed the edge of the table, waiting for the blood to return to his head. "I'm going up to the jagged ridge," Boone said. His voice was raspy. Clarissa looked up from the hearth. She didn't have the energy to stand. "It sleeted yesterday and froze solid overnight. The crust is ice. You won't be able to track." "If I don't track, we don't eat," Boone replied, pulling his heavy elk-hide coat from the peg. "It's avalanche weather, Boone." Clarissa's voice cracked. She pulled Nellie tighter against her collarbone. "The snow is too heavy on top of the ice layer. You take a rifle shot up there, the whole mountain will come down on you." Boone sat on the bench, pulling on his boots. He strapped his snowshoes over his boots, pulling the leather bindings tight with his teeth. The leather tasted like dirt and old sweat. "I know the mountain, Clarissa. You're starving too." She pressed, a sudden edge of panic bleeding into her exhaustion. "Your hands are shaking. If you die up there, we die down here." Boone paused. He looked at his hand. She was right. A fine, uncontrollable tremor was vibrating through his fingers. He clenched his fist tight, burying it deep into his coat pocket. He looked at the bed, at the hollow-eyed children watching him from beneath the furs. He looked at Clarissa, seeing the desperate, trapped animal fear in her eyes. He had spent 5 years making sure no one's survival depended on him. He had built a fortress of isolation, and in 2 months, this frail, stubborn woman and her brood had completely dismantled it. "Boil some water," Boone said gruffly, grabbing his Winchester and a coil of heavy rope. "Have it hot when I get back. Meat needs to cook slow when the stomach is empty." He didn't wait for her to argue. He pushed the heavy door open. The blinding glare of the afternoon sun hitting the snow crust felt like physical needles in his eyes. He stepped out, leaving the gloomy, sour-smelling cabin behind, and began the brutal climb. The wind at 7,000 feet didn't just blow, it scoured. It carried microscopic shards of ice that tore at the exposed skin around Boone's eyes. His thighs burned with a deep, lactic fire. Every step in the snowshoes required him to lift his foot out of the deep powder beneath the crust, a punishing rhythm that drained his rapidly dwindling energy. His lungs felt like they were stuffed with burning rags. He found the tracks 3 hours in. They were deep, plunging post holes in the snow crust. An elk, a big bull, moving slow, dragging its hooves. It was starving too, dropping down from the high alpine passes looking for lichen or stripped bark. Boone unslung his rifle, the oiled steel biting through his thick leather gloves. He followed the tracks, his breathing loud and jagged in the crushing silence of the woods. The smell of pine pitch and pure, ozone-sharp cold filled his nose. He crested a rocky outcropping and saw it. The elk was standing in a small clearing of naked aspens, stripping the pale bark with its lower teeth. It was a massive animal, but its ribs showed clearly against its matted grey-brown winter coat. Boone dropped to one knee. The snow crunched loudly beneath him. The elk's head snapped up, its ears swiveling. Boone cocked the hammer. The metallic clack echoed off the granite walls. Before Boone could settle the iron sights on the elk's lungs, A blur of tawny motion exploded from the branches of an overhanging spruce. It wasn't a wolf, it was a mountain lion. The cat was desperate, driven mad by the same winter starvation that was killing the cabin. It landed squarely on the elk's back, its claws sinking deep into the hide. The elk let out a horrific, shrieking bugle, a sound like tearing metal, and bucked violently, crashing through the deep snow. Boone didn't hesitate. He couldn't afford to let the cat drag the meat down the ravine. He tracked the thrashing mass of fur and antlers through his sights and pulled the trigger. The Winchester roared, kicking hard against his bruised shoulder. The heavy lead slug hit the elk high in the shoulder, shattering the bone. The massive beast collapsed into the snow, taking the cougar down with it in a flurry of white powder. Boone ejected the spent casing. It spun through the air, smoking, and hissed as it hit the snow. He racked another round and moved forward, his boots sinking deep. The elk was dead, but the snow was churning. The cougar scrambled out from under the massive carcass. It was gaunt, its flanks sucked in, its yellow eyes wide and blown black with panic and rage. It didn't run. Starvation had erased its natural fear of man. It saw Boone, smelled the blood, and flattened its ears. It lunged. Boone fired, but his frozen, trembling hands betrayed him. The shot went wide, grazing the cat's ribs. The cougar hit him with the force of a falling boulder, knocking him backward. The rifle flew from his grip, vanishing into a snowdrift. Boone hit the ground hard, the wind violently knocked from his lungs. The smell of the cat was overwhelming. Rank, musky, rotting meat and wild animal sweat. Claws tore through his heavy elk-hide coat like it was wet paper. Searing, blinding pain ripped across his left forearm. Boone roared, a primal, wordless sound, and drew his skinning knife from his belt with his right hand. He didn't aim. He just thrust upward blindly, driving the 6-inch steel blade deep into the cat's chest. Hot, wet blood sprayed across his face, smelling sharply of copper and bile. The cat shrieked, a terrible, human-like scream, bit down once on Boone's shoulder, and then went limp, its massive weight collapsing entirely onto him. Boone lay there in the bloody snow, gasping for air. The sky above was a brilliant, uncaring blue. The pain in his arm was a pulsing, white-hot fire, but the cold was already rushing in to numb it. He shoved the heavy carcass off him with a grunt of agony. His left sleeve was saturated, the dark blood already beginning to freeze and turn black in the frigid air. "Get up," his brain commanded. "You stop moving, you die." He dragged himself to his feet. He had no time to process the near death. The sun was dipping below the tree line, painting the snow in shades of bruised purple. The temperature was dropping fast. Working with one good arm, Boone quickly bled the elk. He couldn't carry the whole thing. He hacked frantically at the hindquarters, his knife slipping in his bloody grip. He strapped the heavy slabs of meat and the back straps to his makeshift sled. The drag-back was a waking nightmare. Every pull on the sled ropes tore at the lacerations on his arm and shoulder. His vision narrowed to a dark tunnel. He tasted iron in his mouth. He didn't know if he was walking or dreaming. He just followed his own bloody footprints back down the mountain, driven by a stubborn, irrational refusal to let the ghosts in his cabin win. It was pitch black when Boone hit the door. He didn't open it. He just fell against it. The heavy oak shuddered. Inside, the latch rattled frantically. The door swung open, and Boone collapsed face first onto the dirt floor, dragging the sled rope with him. "Boone!" Clarissa was on her knees beside him instantly. The children shrank back against the far wall, their eyes wide. The smell of fresh, raw meat filled the cabin, instantly overpowering the stale air, but it was accompanied by the heavy, metallic stench of fresh blood. Boone rolled onto his back, his chest heaving. His face was smeared with frozen blood. Meat, he gasped, his eyes rolling back slightly. Outside. Tom scrambled out the door, dragging the sled over the threshold before slamming it shut against the wind. Clarissa ripped Boone's coat open. The left sleeve of his wool undershirt was glued to his skin with frozen blood. "Get my scissors!" she yelled to Mary. "And the boiling water." She didn't wait for the scissors. She grabbed his hunting knife from its sheath and sliced the wool from his forearm. She gasped. 4 deep, jagged, parallel trenches ran from his elbow to his wrist. The flesh was laid open to the yellow fat, sluggishly oozing dark blood in the warmth of the cabin. Boone grabbed her wrist with his good hand. His grip was terrifyingly strong. Don't take the arm." "I'm not taking your arm," Clarissa said, her voice dropping an octave, losing its panic and hardening into pure steel. "But I have to clean it, or it will rot." Mary brought the pot of boiling water and a clean, albeit ragged, linen towel. "Hold him," Clarissa ordered Tom, who had rushed back over. "Pin his shoulders down." Boone was a massive man, but exhaustion had drained him. Still, when Clarissa poured the steaming water directly over the open wounds to wash away the dirt and the cougar's saliva, he arched off the floor. A guttural roar ripped from his throat, echoing off the log walls. Tom threw his whole body weight across Boone's chest, struggling to hold the mountain man down. Clarissa didn't flinch. She grabbed a bottle of raw whiskey from the shelf, uncorked it with her teeth, and dumped half of it into the lacerations. Boone passed out. The sudden silence was deafening, save for the crackle of the fire. Clarissa sat back on her heels, breathing heavily. She looked at the raw, gaping wounds, then up at the sled, piled high with hundreds of pounds of fresh elk meat. He had walked into the teeth of the mountain, fought a predator, and dragged half a carcass down a freezing slope, all to feed children that weren't his. She grabbed the bone needle she had used to sew the boots. She threaded it with heavy cotton string, sterilized it in the boiling water, and began the brutal work of stitching the man back together. She pushed the needle through his tough, calloused skin, her hands steady, guided by the grim realization that the man on the floor was no longer just their jailer or their host. He was their lifeline, and she was his. The infection hit Boone on the second day. It didn't creep in, it kicked the door down. By nightfall, his skin was radiating heat like a cast-iron stove. Sweat poured off his face, matting his beard and soaking the furs Clarissa had piled over him. The red, angry skin around her crude stitches swelled, pulling the heavy cotton thread taut until it looked like it might snap. Clarissa took control of the cabin. She had to. "Tom," she ordered, handing the boy Boone's heavy skinning knife. "Cut the back straps into thin strips. If you slice it too thick, the little ones will choke, and they can't digest it anyway. Mary, keep the fire hot. Seth, get me a bucket of clean snow from the deep drift behind the shed." She didn't wait for them to argue or drag their feet. The tone in her voice brokered absolute obedience. She took a slab of the elk meat, scored it, and laid it directly onto the flat stones at the edge of the hearth. Within minutes, the smell of searing fat and roasting meat filled the cabin. It was a heavy, intoxicating scent that made Clarissa's stomach cramp violently. The children migrated toward the hearth like sleepwalkers, their hollow eyes fixed on the sizzling meat. When it was done, she didn't let them gorge. She handed out small, charred pieces, forcing them to chew slowly. The meat was tough and gamey, lacking salt or seasoning, but it was life. As the protein hit their starving systems, a heavy, exhausted silence fell over the room. For the first time in weeks, the children slept without shivering. Clarissa didn't sleep. She sat on the dirt floor beside Boone's pallet. He was trapped in a violent delirium. His massive frame thrashed against the floorboards, his hands balling into fists as he fought ghosts Clarissa couldn't see. He muttered in a raspy, broken voice, the words tumbling over each other in a stream of panic. "Don't cross the ice, Sarah, don't—" Boone choked on a dry cough, his chest heaving. "The current, it's too fast, grab the root." Clarissa froze. Sarah. The wife? Boone's head whipped to the side, his eyes snapping open. But he wasn't seeing the cabin roof. His pupils were blown wide, tracking something in his memory. "I had her hand," he whispered, a sound of such pure, unadulterated agony that it made Clarissa's throat tight. The ice broke. "I had her hand." He squeezed his eyes shut, a single tear cutting a track through the soot and dried blood on his cheek. He went limp, his breathing turning ragged and shallow. Clarissa dipped a rag into the bucket of melted snow. She wrung it out, the icy water biting at her raw, bare-greased knuckles. She folded the rag and pressed it gently against Boone's forehead. He flinched at the cold, then let out a long, shuddering sigh, leaning into the touch. She sat there for 3 days and 3 nights. When the fever spiked, she packed his arm in snow, fighting the swelling. When he thrashed, she held his good shoulder down, using her entire body weight to keep him from tearing the stitches. She fed him the cloudy elk broth, lifting his head and tipping the tin cup against his cracked lips, ignoring the times he spat it up or knocked it away in his delirium. She saw the man stripped of his impenetrable armor. He wasn't a mountain of a man who needed no one. He was a man who had lost everything to the brutal apathy of the frontier, and had decided the only way to survive was to never care again. On the morning of the 4th day, the fever broke. Boone opened his eyes. The cabin was quiet, filled with the pale, grey light of dawn. The oppressive, sour smell of sickness had faded, replaced by the scent of drying herbs and wood smoke. He tried to sit up, but his body felt like it was made of wet sand. His left arm throbbed with a dull, heavy ache, wrapped tightly in clean linen bandages. He turned his head. Clarissa was asleep, sitting upright against the log wall, her head tipped back. Dark, bruised shadows hung under her eyes. Her calico dress was stained with dried blood and grease. She looked terrible. She looked beautiful. Boone swallowed dryly. His throat felt like sandpaper. He shifted his weight, and the floorboards creaked. Clarissa snapped awake instantly, her hand flying to the iron poker resting beside her. She blinked, her eyes focusing on him. She dropped the iron and let out a long, shaky breath. "You're awake," she said, her voice rough from disuse. "Water." Boone managed to croak. She scrambled up, grabbing the tin dipper from the bucket, and brought it to his lips. He drank greedily, the cold water soothing the fire in his throat. When he finished, he fell back against the furs, exhausted by the simple effort. "How long?" he asked. 4 days, Clarissa said, taking the dipper away. "The infection was bad. I thought you were going to lose the arm." Boone looked down at the heavy bandaging. Then he looked around the room. The children were asleep, tucked under the wolf pelts. A large stack of split wood sat by the fire. Slabs of elk meat hung from the rafters, smoking slowly over the embers. She had kept them alive. She had kept him alive. "You butchered the elk," Boone said quietly. "Tom helped," she replied, wiping her hands on her apron. "He's a good worker when he's not being yelled at." Boone closed his eyes, the ghost of a smirk pulling at the corner of his mouth. "Reckon I owe you my life, Clarissa." "You fed my children," she said, her voice softening. "We're even." Boone didn't answer. He just listened to the steady, rhythmic breathing of the sleeping children, a sound that used to grate on his nerves but now felt strangely grounding. They weren't even, not by a long shot. The winter didn't surrender easily, but by late April, the sun began to win. The heavy snowpack collapsed, turning the mountain into a treacherous, sliding mess of grey slush and brown mud. The air changed, losing its sterile, metallic bite. It smelled of wet pine needles, thawing earth, and rot. The eaves of the cabin dripped continuously, a rhythmic, hollow tapping that marked the passing of the seconds. Boone stood by the chopping block, splitting kindling. He swung the axe with his right hand, guiding it loosely with his left. The cougar had permanently damaged the muscle in his forearm. The thick, ugly pink scars pulled tight whenever he gripped anything too hard. He was slower, stiffer, but he was alive. He buried the axe into the stump and wiped the sweat from his forehead. He looked down the mountain. The trail to Oakhaven, buried under 10 feet of snow for 5 months, was visible again. A dark, muddy scar cutting through the trees. The pass was open. Inside the cabin, the heavy, suffocating tension of winter had lifted. The door stood wide open, letting the warm spring breeze flush out the stale air. Clarissa was at the table, kneading a thick lump of dough. Her hands were still rough, but the bleeding cracks had healed. Her face had filled out, losing the skeletal pallor of starvation. Seth and Caleb were outside, chasing each other through the mud with sticks, their laughter echoing off the granite cliffs. Baby Nellie was sitting on a buffalo hide in the sun, chewing contentedly on a smooth piece of bone. Boone walked up the porch steps, his boots squelching heavily. He stopped in the doorway, blocking the sunlight. Clarissa looked up, pushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear with the back of a flour-dusted wrist. "Dinner will be ready in an hour. I traded some of the smoked elk to that trapper who passed by yesterday for a bag of beans." "The trail is clear," Boone said. Clarissa's hands stopped moving. The dough sat heavy on the flour-dusted boards. She didn't look at him. She stared down at her hands. "The snow is melted off the lower ridge," Boone continued, his voice perfectly flat, devoid of any inflection. It was the voice he used when he was trying very hard to hide what he was feeling. "Mules can make it down now. The railroad depot in Cheyenne is about a 4-day ride if the mud ain't too deep." The silence in the cabin stretched. The sound of the children playing outside suddenly felt miles away. "I told you I'd take you to the rail car when the spring thaw came," Boone said, crossing his arms over his chest. His thumb absently rubbed the thick scars on his left forearm. "A deal's a deal. You can be out of this dirt box by Friday." Clarissa slowly wiped the flour from her hands on a damp rag. She didn't turn around. "Did I ask you to hitch the wagon, Boone?" Boone frowned, his brow furrowing. "No, but we made an agreement." "That was in November," Clarissa said. She turned to face him, leaning back against the edge of the table. Her eyes were steady, analyzing him. She knew him now. She knew the gruffness was a shield. "That was when we were strangers. When you thought we were a burden you'd have to bury." "You deserve a real town," Boone said harshly, his voice rising slightly. "With a school for the kids, a doctor, a house with real floors, not packed dirt. This ain't a place to raise a family, Clarissa. It's a place to hide. And what are you hiding from, Boone?" She fired back, not raising her voice, but her words carried the sharp sting of truth. "Because if you send us away, you're just going to sit up here in the quiet until you forget how to speak again." Boone's jaw tightened. He looked away, staring at the cast-iron skillets hanging on the wall. "I'm a solitary man. I like the quiet." "You're a liar," Clarissa said softly. Boone snapped his head back, his eyes flashing. "You like the quiet because the quiet doesn't die on you," Clarissa continued, stepping away from the table. She closed the distance between them, stopping just a foot away. She didn't flinch from his glare. You think if you don't let anyone in, you won't have to watch them leave. You think sending us to Cheyenne is doing us a favor, but it's just you protecting yourself. Boone breathed heavily through his nose, his massive chest rising and falling. He wanted to yell at her. He wanted to tell her to pack her bags. He wanted his empty, safe, silent cabin back. But he looked at her. He looked at the woman who had fought a fever for 4 days to keep him breathing. He listened to the laughter of the boys outside. He remembered the feeling of the ice giving way, of the hand slipping from his grasp all those years ago. He didn't want to let go this time. "If you go to Cheyenne," Boone said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper, his throat tight, "you'll be living in a boarding house, sewing shirts for pennies. The boys will be sweeping floors." "I know," Clarissa said. "Up here, the winters are brutal. The work doesn't stop. We'll have to expand the cabin before October, cut more timber." Boone swallowed hard. He uncrossed his arms, his hands hanging uselessly at his sides. "The quiet. It gets too loud now when you all are asleep." Clarissa's tough exterior finally cracked. A slow, genuine smile spread across her face, reaching her eyes. It was a beautiful, tired, resilient thing. "Then we better start cutting timber," she said. She turned back to the table and sank her hands into the dough. Boone stood in the doorway for a long moment, the spring breeze pulling at his beard. The knot behind his ribs, the cold iron weight he had carried for 5 years, was gone. He stepped out onto the porch, looking down at Tom, who was trying to wrangle the stubborn mule, Rust, into the corral. "Tom!" Boone barked, his voice echoing over the ridge. The boy froze, looking up toward the porch with wide eyes. Boone leaned against the heavy oak post. "Leave the mule be. Grab the draw knife. We need to start peeling logs for an addition." Tom grinned, dropping the rope, and took off running towards the tool shed. Boone watched him go, then looked back into the cabin. Clarissa was humming as she worked the bread. The frontier didn't forgive mistakes, and it didn't give second chances often. Boone walked down the steps into the mud, ready to build a home. Boone and Clarissa's story is just beginning, and the brutal winter hasn't even hit yet. Can a solitary mountain man and a fiercely protective mother survive the elements, the starvation, and the dangerous men who think Clarissa is entirely unprotected? Or will the mountain claim them all? Drop a like if you're rooting for this unconventional family, share this with someone who loves gritty Western romances, and make sure to subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss part 4. The real danger is just over the ridge,